So this evening, in an extraordinary and rare move, a New York State judge found that Donald Trump committed fraud without even needing a trial and a jury to weigh in on the evidence. In the civil lawsuit brought by New York State Attorney General Letitia James, the judge found the ex-president committed years-long business fraud, inflated his assets to get favorable loans and insurance deals. The judge agreed with the state attorney general, and the ruling is, frankly, scathing. The judge writes that, quote, in Trump's world, rent-regulated apartments are worth the same as unregulated apartments. Restricted land is worth the same as unrestricted land. Restrictions can evaporate into thin air. That is a fantasy world, not the real world. The judge granted summary judgment on specifically the fraud claim, meaning the attorney general's office proved or provided so much overwhelming evidence, the judge ruled it does not even need to go to trial. Like, that's it. You got me. I'm convinced. Now, here's the other thing. As a remedy, the judge also ordered the cancellation of Donald Trump's business certificates in New York. And this ruling tonight means the Trump Organization, in New York at least, is basically facing legal extinction, I think. Lisa Rubin is a former litigator, now an MSNBC legal analyst. Charles Coleman prosecuted civil cases on behalf of the U.S. government, now as a civil rights and criminal defense attorney. They both join me now. Charles, let me just start with you on, I mean, in civil litigation, parties will ask for summary judgment, the motion to dismiss, summary judgment. How often does the plaintiff get a judge being like, I've seen enough?
Right. It is extraordinarily rare that this occurs. Summary judgment, as a notion, as you were just talking about, is one of the things that routinely is filed but isn't always granted. And when you find it being granted, it's almost the equivalent of hitting a home run on the first pitch.
Right.
It's that significant to lose on summary judgment. And so I think there's something to be noted there, of course. But what is also important and noteworthy is the fact that there were sanctions for Trump's attorneys attached to this order. That in and of itself is incredibly significant because judges are very much so loath to give out sanctions, and they make a very compelling case as to why sanctions were issued here.
I want to come back to the sanctions because this is also a theme we've seen in Trump litigation, is like sanctions against attorneys, which again just doesn't happen that often. Like usually people practice before the court, you can push things as far as they go and not over, and people don't do that, and we don't see that often. What is the finding here? It was 8 counts, right, that they were suing him over. This is
7, I believe.
7. This is the first of 7.
Correct.
So there's going to be a trial on those others.
Right.
What's the significance of what the judge found?
Judge found that the Attorney General's team offered enough proof to demonstrate that Donald Trump, his adult sons, Alan Weisselberg, the former CFO, Jeff McConney, the controller, and a number of business entities engaged in a persistent, years-long fraud through misrepresenting the values of various properties in his statements of financial condition. Those are essentially like charts full of his assets, making representations as to their value that are routinely provided to lenders, to insurance companies. And they say, the judge says in this ruling, you have given me enough for me to find as an evidentiary ruling that he has engaged in this persistent fraud.
And just to be clear here, it's one thing whether you're on the Forbes list or not, but it doesn't matter really one way or the other.
Right.
When you go, I mean, everyone knows this, but just it's worth saying, when you go to a lender, it matters how much you have in collateral in terms of the loan conditions. And when you go to an insurer, it matters how much or how little they're insuring. If you're fudging on both of them, you're functionally defrauding them and taking money from both entities.
That's true. And the judge says here, look, it doesn't matter to me that the bank still would have loaned you money or that they got repaid. What you're doing here is effectively messing with the integrity of public markets. Because if you can do this, then anyone can do this, and nobody's representation means anything. And that's a bad thing for financial institutions.
And to your other point, Chris, of the remaining counts on the actual complaint, there is insurance fraud. There are 2 insurance fraud counts that remain that are going to be litigated by Tish James and the Office of the Attorney General because of the fact that when you make these misrepresentations, it does change the scope and the tenor of what it is that you're asking for and how you are impacting the different markets.
Yeah, I mean, anyone's bought a house. There's an appraiser, and they establish the value for the bank, the mortgage. And in fact, one of the things, and I remember covering this, one of the things that went so haywire in the 2006-2007 run up to the bursting of the bubble was that whole system got juiced, right? So you got people paying off appraisers to fudge the values. You start doing that, things get real dicey. Okay, So they find that there's going to be a trial on the other stuff. I read the order, revocation, or I don't know what the word is, but the business licenses, essentially.
Right, the cancellation of the business certificate.
Cancellation of the business certificate. What does that mean?
It effectively means that you can't do business under a fictitious name here in New York. The cancellation of the business certificates isn't really the worst form of relief. What really has the impact here is the order that the LLCs, meaning limited liability companies through which Donald Trump did business in New York, have to be dissolved. Because if you have to dissolve a company, then the question becomes, well, what do you do with the assets of those companies?
Right.
And I asked that question to a source familiar with the litigation who said the assets can be sold, they can be transferred, to be determined, but that will be up to a receiver appointed by the court, and with the court's approval, disposition of these assets will be determined.
So there's like a court-appointed receivership in bankruptcy, a court-appointed receiver doing like a Trump or garage sale, like.
Not necessarily a sale. There could be transfers. But to your point, one of the other things the Attorney General has asked for here after trial is what's called disgorgement, basically saying there are ill-gotten gains, and we want $250 million
back,
at least from Trump. The question becomes then, where do you get that $250 million if Trump's not liquid? And that's where the receiver's disposition of the assets could be particularly important.
Here's one asset, the Trump Tower apartment in which Donald Trump resided for decades, roughly 11,000 square feet. Between 2012 and 2016, Donald Trump submitted statement of financial condition falsely claiming the triplex was 30,000 square feet. Seems easily checkable, resulting in an overvaluation between $114 and $207 million. Good faith measurements could vary by as much as 20%, not 200%. A discrepancy of this order of magnitude by a real estate developer sizing up his own living space of decades can only be considered fraud. I love that line because it's like, well, it's hard to disagree with that.
And I think it's important to understand the standard with respect to summary judgment is that you consider the facts in the light most favorable to the non-moving party.
Yes.
So basically, when the
Donald
judge
Trump
looked at this,
exactly. Yes.
The judge looked at this case and said, in the best light, looking at this for Donald Trump, is there any way that I can find that there is an issue of dispute such that warrants a trial? And the answer was a resounding no. And I thought it was very interesting that he seized on that particular fact as an example of how extensive this fraud was to prove their point.
Well,
it's not even the worst one.
That's not even the worst one. But when I read that one, I thought, like, right. And there's a whole bunch of other examples. You read that and you think, like, yeah, he's dead to rights, which is basically what the judge decided tonight. Lisa Rubin, Charles Coleman, thank you both.